Hey everyone, and welcome to week 14. We're talking about what makes the world dangerous this week, and I think it's probably a topic that you guys will enjoy. I think it's one of the more interesting ones that we look at in this course, and it's kind of an interesting way to wrap up what has otherwise been a kind of a recent focus on economics. One of the things that we've learned in our study of economics is not just about the impact of neoliberalism, but the impact of the fact that we now live in a world of global networks and how financial crises can travel through these networks, contaminating country after country like a series of dominoes falling over. That seems to be something which happened during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and it seems to be something that's happened in the world more recently if we look at the impact of the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States and how it's traveled around the world, collapsing as we studied before the Icelandic economy, the various other economies in Europe like Ireland, etc. So this week we're looking at another major change that's sort of swept the world over the past 10, 15 years. And of course, not just in that time period, but most sort of symbolically in that time period, because of course that's the time that we call post September 11th, sort of as we sort of use this term a post 9/11 environment, because that seems to have really been the sort of catalyst for moving a lot of what we're about to talk about from being sort of like more theoretically obscure on the margins of how security strategists think about how it is that the world ought to be made safe to actually being sort of like mainstream. Because of course what happened on 9/11 was the attack upon the World Trade Center, which was a tremendous symbol of network power. It was a global nodal point in global information technology systems to do with financial trading. A lot of different people lived there. I mean, huge numbers of Pakistanis, British, Germans, Americans, people from all over the world. Even some Irish people were in those buildings when they got hit. So, you know, what amount of buildings in the world could be said to have people from so many different countries present in them at the time of a terrorist incident? And of course, as I'm recording this, we're getting news of an attack in Boston. This is, of course, being recorded on April 15th in 2013. So, clearly, 12 years after September 11th, terrorism hasn't gone away. It's not clear at the moment from the news reports coming in what the cause of these explosions were, but it seems rather reliable to think that if those bombs are going off at the conclusion of a marathon in a city, then there's probably some sort of terrorist activity behind it. So, that's a reality that we have to contend with. And if we want to ask what makes the world dangerous, then certainly we could say things like that are clearly part of the answer to the story, or answer to the question. But as with what we typically do in these sorts of situations, we're also very interested in asking the question about what frameworks of seeing, what frameworks of knowledge we use to make sense of this. And so when we ask the question this week, what makes the world dangerous, I think we're asking it from the point of view of scholars who are interested in the fact that we live in a world that seems to be mystified to us on the one hand, but also a world that we are compelled to see through certain categories of thinking, certain understandings of what counts as truth and not truth. And I think this week what we're going to be interested in looking at is as much the terrorism, or as much the ways of seeing, the ways of making truth, as it is the actual terrorism itself. So the author of this week's chapter is Michael Dillon, and he opens by asking the question, what does it mean to live dangerously these days? He notices that danger is sort of a subjective thing anyway. It is subject to change. And we know this because, of course, if you look at the broad sweep of human history, one of the things we can see is that danger, while people in certain times tend to think of danger as a sort of a certain thing, people in other times might have thought about it differently. So one of the things that Dillon seems to want to argue is that the link between who we are as political actors is caught up in this question of how we perceive danger. And he uses the term political subjectivity here. But what that really means is that we are subjects of politics who are, as part of our society, brought to see dangers in certain ways. So we saw this a little bit in the Power of Nightmares video that we watched in this course way back at the beginning, where we saw, for example, that political dangers are manipulated by political leaders all over the world, really. I mean, it happens here in America, it happens in Ireland, it happens in the Middle East, it happened in Yugoslavia, as we discussed in class, where politicians clearly do try to use the fears of the people to maintain their power. So it's not for nothing then that Michael Dillon says that danger is one of the single most important currencies of politics. If you can get people to think that something is dangerous, and you can persuade them that you have the solutions to that problem, especially in democracy, but not exclusively, they will be much more likely to support you, to support your regime. So in that sense, we have already a very direct connection to the way in which danger and fear can be political. Now, interestingly, some politicians have tried to speak out against that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said that Americans had nothing to fear but fear itself. And what he meant by that was, of course, that fear had become self-perpetuating for Americans. And he was talking specifically in relation to an ongoing financial crisis that was kind of hurting America at this time, the so-called Great Depression. And it was the American economy, it was said at the time, was suffering because people had no confidence in the market. People had no confidence in the idea that the market would be recovering anytime soon. And the recession was a very long one. And in order to solve it, at the end of the day, what they resorted to was what we've called in our economics section fiscal economics or Keynesian economics, which is the idea of going out and just basically, because the private investors won't invest in the market, the government has to go out there and do it for them. And some people call that socialism, but other people just say it's good economics. Because in the long run, it's not really socialism if the government plans on getting out of the market once it's entered into the market. As Keynes himself said, it's fine if you want to use a free market solution, but he said, remember, in the long run, we're all dead, and we want to have some prosperity in our own lifetime. So this is how you do it. You try to restore confidence. You try to dispel fear from the marketplace by bringing the government in as an employer of last resort and getting money back into the local level of the economy, at the micro level of the economy, get people spending in those grocery stores again. And then the private sector sees that people are spending, takes that as a signal that it can start producing and investing and taking risks again. And then the government can step out because the private sector has heated up and is now ready to do the work itself. So this is all kind of par for the course, really, in terms of the significance of fear. But we were talking about this FDR quote just briefly. I think the important thing that FDR was recognizing was that fear is really real, politically and socially. It's very real, and it can be contagious, and it can change the way people think about their world. So now, can we ever fully get rid of fear? No. I think what Michael Dillon is arguing is that fear and insecurity are kind of intrinsic to what we are as human beings. After all, we all die someday, so that is kind of part and parcel of what it means to be alive. But of course, that said, it's not clear what is going to sort of get our attention as we're alive in terms of fear. I mean, there's a lot of dangers that we live with in our lives every day that we're not aware of at all, and certain dangers become salient in the public mind. So what determines what determines how things get selected to be made dangerous, if you know what I mean, socially? Cigarette smoking, for example, used to be considered healthy for you. And then, as you will probably know if you've been watching my favorite ever TV show, which is Mad Men, from episode 1, season 1, which I've been on at you guys to watch because I think it's that good, we know that the government sort of in the 50s stepped in and said, hey, by the way, the science shows that cigarette smoking is actually really bad for you. And then the cigarette companies had to sort of respond to that actually by exploiting the fear, by taking the fear that people had of death and sort of also noting that people had a thrill, what Freud called the death drive. People took a thrill from being close to the margin of death. They didn't really feel alive unless they were dying. So that's the thrill of extreme sports, for example. Why do people enjoy extreme sports? Because they feel alive. They feel like they're really very, very challenged. There's nothing more uninteresting than a life that people find systematic. And so how do you live a non-systematic life? That's the key question. So for all these reasons, I guess life is dangerous, and the reality is, as we said, that like cigarette smoking, it's not always the case that we know what's dangerous for us until our scientists or our ways of seeing, our methods and institutions that allow us to see truth like that speak up and identify things or discover things that they didn't know before. Tomorrow we might find out that, I don't know, highlighter pens are really dangerous for us, but we didn't know that today, and we weren't anxious about them today. Michael Dillon, I think, would argue, though, that because of mass communication technologies, we are sort of increasingly in the cycle of fear. We're in the grip of the cycle of fear. And what that means is that in an age of instant news and telecommunications, where also the TV stations are trying to sell advertising in order to make a profit, there's an interest on their side to sustain and to maintain this sense of emergency, this sense of sudden threat or risk. And I think because of that, there's a concern on the part of many people, many critics, that right now television can't really be a proper medium of communication because it's so kind of caught up in itself, its own self-referentiality. It becomes a feeding, a self-perpetuating frenzy, if you will, of emergency. And this is why, especially after 9/11, many people became very critical of the way the media was operating. So I think one thing that we can conclude from this slide is that those institutions that Stephen Colbert was talking about, if we go back to week 1 of this semester, we were talking about Stephen Colbert and we were talking about truthification and things like this. And we noted that the institutions that create knowledge for us include things like, science, religion, handed down knowledge of the ages. I think those kinds of institutions play very large here, and so in this sense, our fears are, one of the things we're concluding here is that our fears are kind of not just things we pick off the supermarket shelf, as Michael Dillon argues in his chapter. They are crafted for us socially, and we inherit them, just like cigarette smoking. We did not inherit that once upon a time. Now we do. Now we're born knowing into a world that knows very well that cigarette smoking is bad for you. And of course we can be anxious about that, because danger, the more surrounded by danger we are, the more worried we are for ourselves, and that's entirely fair, I suppose. So in this slide we see a familiar face. This is the face of Michel Foucault, and here I think Michael Dillon asks us to reflect a little bit more on this point about cigarettes, for example, or global warming, for example. What is the connection between the way we find out about dangers and how we live? So I think what Foucault wants to ask about in this idea that there's a connection between knowledge and danger, and more specifically between knowledge and power, is that we should think about the stakes of the way that we know danger, right? Because obviously the stakes can be enormous, right? Major decisions of governance are going to be made based on what our politicians conclude or don't conclude from the information about danger that's coming to them from various sources that they have at their disposal. So, interestingly here, Foucault uses the term problematization to refer to the way in which knowledge, communication, and political power interface or come together to translate all this data that's out there in the world into solid, coherent stories or accounts of danger that subsequently demand action. So problematization is the way that we bring data together to make problems out of it, right? Because there's thousands and millions of problems out there. I mean, and the problems that face you in your life might be completely different than the problems that face me in mine. But we need to bring the media in, we need to bring the government in, and various techniques and knowledges of seeing, in order to make problems. Not just anything gets made a problem, There are continuously issues that don't get discussed in the media. There are continuously issues that don't get our attention as a national public. And so we want to ask how that happens. How do these issues get selected or not selected, as the case may be? So one thing we know about problematization from the way Foucault discusses it is that this is also a very defective process, that dangers come together and start to fall apart just as soon as they've come together. We find exceptions to the rule, and we find caveats. And I think this is partially, well, Foucault explains this. He says that it's all really to do with the fact that, there's no such thing as perfect knowledge, right? No one truth as a statement can ever capture the full complexity of the world that's out there. We saw this, for example, very clearly in our lecture when we asked about the nature of torture and whether it was ethical to torture, and we came up with this theory, the ticking time bomb scenario. But even then we found that there were many exceptions. Ticking time bomb scenario is supposed to be kind of like a baseline that everyone can agree on philosophically is where you would torture, but even then we found that there were many exceptions to the rule. And so this is kind of what we're saying here as well, that problematization is the politics, if you will, of turning data into problems, selecting data from all the data that's out there to turn it into problems or evidence to support the idea that there's problems, and yet perhaps leaving other problems alone. But the what's interesting is, and I think Michael Dillon pretty much puts his finger on it when later in the chapter he offers us this following quote from Donald Rumsfeld, which I think says a lot about where we are in relation to security today. One of the themes of this lecture is that we have to think about the difference between contemporary security studies and its relationship to truth and knowledge compared to the old school approach. And Donald Rumsfeld is one of the new school guys. As you guys may remember, Rumsfeld was George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. And he got a lot of grief in his career for saying, especially during the 9/11 years, he would say some very kind of odd-sounding things sometimes, and people would make fun of him on Saturday Night Live and other things for saying this kind of stuff. But in a way, what I want to suggest is that the quote here kind of backs up what Foucault is saying. I mean, let's just read it for a minute. He said this in a press conference. He said, "There are known knowns. These are things that we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know." And this is, of course, referring to uncertainty, which is one of the major themes of this lecture. And I think Foucault also wants to say that there's a lot about, and why does Foucault use this term problematization? Because he wants to argue to us too, just like Donald Rumsfeld, that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world out there. But the difference, of course, is that where Foucault would say, okay, he's a philosopher, right? Foucault is a philosopher. He would be very sort of interested in the philosophical question of what it means to think about uncertainty. And so he would say, hey, let's back up here, right? We don't know everything. We can't know everything. So, and the more we would try to know everything, the more paranoid we would become. But Rumsfeld and the Bush administration, I think, instead of embracing this Foucauldian approach, which is attested to here in this statement, what they actually did was they actually doubled down on knowledge measurement and knowledge attainment. They doubled down on the idea that it is possible to change the world and to make it more knowable, and I think many people would argue that this was sort of a tremendous arrogance then on Rumsfeld's part, that he felt that this was possible. But when you think about the fact that they said that the Iraq War would be over in 6 months, that it wouldn't take very many soldiers in order to bring Iraq down and to get it set up as a modern contemporary country. When you think about the fact that there was a massive efforts to find out the truth, to know the unknowns about American society, for example, during the War on Terror, when they introduced the idea of warrantless wiretapping, which goes against the tenets of the U.S. Constitution and international law, I suppose. Then, and of course, Obama himself, more contemporarily, has continued some of this, because now we know that there's license, even sort of taking things even further. There's license now, perhaps in this country, to kill U.S. citizens without a warrant if those citizens are deemed to be enemy combatants as part of the war on terror. So for Foucault, I mean, this would be the epitome of the wrong way to go with things, right? And he would be saying that, look, I mean, just because you're sort of face to face with the complexity of knowledge now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sort of lock down and sort of freak out or become paranoid. Some people talk about the birth of the surveillance society that we're all under monitoring now 24/7. In this image, we see the picture of Jean Charles de Menezes, who was a Brazilian citizen who was walking through London one day in 2005 in the middle of a very high level security alert in that city because of the war on terror. And the police thought that he looked like a suspected terrorist, and they saw him go into a subway station. They saw him get on a train, and they ran up behind him and they shot him in the head. And of course, he was nobody, right? He was just a victim of a mistaken identity. But this sort of attests to the problem of what Foucault was talking about, the idea of a surveillance society. And so the question would be, obviously this very sort of hyper sort of paranoid or hyper vigilant security regime, which puts cameras everywhere and puts security officers everywhere and perhaps even armed police everywhere, has the intention of making us safer. But in fact, what it seems to do in its intensity is sometimes trip up. It sometimes makes mistakes. And the question is, are we, in a way, not all Jean Charles de Menezes? I mean, aren't we all, in a way, potentially just as innocent as him? And there's been a subsequent police inquiry that shows that the police were absolutely, following procedure. I mean, it wasn't so much that this was a mistake in a way, this was exactly what was supposed to happen. Not saying that they did. Obviously, the killing of the man was a mistake in no uncertain terms, but the procedures that were used were very much, part of what was supposed to be going on at the time. So it's not, in a way, what I'm trying to say is it's not the police officer's fault. There was a structure of circumstances in place that day, and Jean Charles de Menezes just happened to be the wrong guy in the wrong time. But it could have been any one of us. So when Rumsfeld says there are things we know we don't know, that obviously is an invitation. As Mick Dillon says later in the chapter, there's contradictions that get opened up by these kinds of questions, and in those contradictions there are spaces for critical thinking, and I think that's what we're trying to do here by discussing Jean Charles de Menezes. So what do we need to know about the revolution in military affairs? Well, one thing we can see from the diagram here on the slide is that our military and weapon systems and communication systems have clearly been informationalized. You can see quite clearly how information is a major part of what armies do today, good armies anyway. And the question Michael Dillon wants to raise is how does this relate to what Foucault was talking about in our previous slides? We were talking about Foucault as a scholar who thought about problematization, and problematization being, of course, how data is brought together to make problems through specific ways of seeing. And of course, in that decision to see, we of course also decide not to see certain other things. So what are the politics of this? What gets put in the foreground, what gets put in the background? In this slide, we're asking the question about the revolution in military affairs and the era of network-centric warfare as a mode of behavior that chooses to see certain problems and, of course, fails to see others. So, on one level, this is really, as Michael Dillon argues, it's just a question of equipment. For example, he doesn't discuss this in the chapter, but if you've been following the news this year, you'll know, as do I, that a lot of analysts these days are talking about the existence of a kind of a low-level cyber warfare status between China and the United States of America. Well, actually, more specifically, American corporations. It seems that they have been coming under a lot of pressure from Chinese hackers of late. And so certainly there you can see that the revolution in military affairs literally is taking information and turning it into a weapon. But then, of course, we have another aspect to think about, which is how the revolution in military affairs, of the RMA as it's called, this emergence of information technologies and weapon systems and the integration of the two, how this has changed our thinking about military strategy. Well, one of the things that Michael Dillon emphasizes, and I think it's very interesting, is that military strategists today seem to be increasingly adopting metaphors drawn from network theory and the biological sciences, i.e. from genetics, from the science of genetics. And so that's why, I guess, when we think about, and we'll look at a case study of this in just a minute, but when we look at military doctrine today as it relates to globalization, we see increasingly that society is thought of as kind of like a code in and of itself. Much the same way as doctors, medical doctors today think about our bodies in terms of codes, genetic codes to be specific. And of course we can get cancer, right? So what is cancer other than a mutation in the information sequence that's embedded in our DNA? So too, security threats today are not thought of as they used to be. It used to be that, we thought of the enemy as someone over there. If you think about the Cold War, the Soviet Union was thought about as an enemy that was removed from us. There was us and them. But in an era of globalization where races and colors and creeds are all mixing up in the flows and networks of globalization, it's very hard to sort of see symbolically how you would pin down an enemy. What does the enemy look like today? They can look like you and me. We have domestic terrorists, we have foreign terrorists, and the foreign terrorists do us the favor of, don't do us any favors. They don't carry a flag around with them. Instead, they look just like us, and they exist in networks, which means they don't come from one country. They come from a virtual space, if you want to put it in those terms, right? And when I say virtual, what I mean is that they exist in networks parallel to, but slightly removed from, the spaces in which you and I already exist. So we're dealing with networked enemies that have no real sort of hierarchy. It's not like we can just take out their boss and then we're safe. Instead, we have to deal with network groups. And as with many things we know about networks already, when the internet was developed, for example, it was developed partially as a way of surviving, of building an information communication structure that would survive nuclear war. You hit one part of a spider web and the spider web doesn't necessarily all fall apart. Similarly, the internet can take a lot of damage before it ceases to be the internet. Information can always travel around the various nodes. Even if a large chunk of it is taken out, you can still go around. You don't have to go directly through. So we've started thinking about this now in terms of our security, and so we think about society in terms of networks, we think about our enemy in terms of networks, and we think about our military in terms of networks as well. This is the era then, if anything, of network thinking. So why is this important? Well, again, it's important because, as I said about doctors looking at our bodies in terms of information vis-a-vis cancer, if we are seeing danger in our society as disturbances in code, our disturbances in networks, then our security measures aren't going to be so much about going over there and getting them. They're going to be internally looking. We're going to be looking inwards at ourselves, and we're going to be checking about and thinking about our own immunity. Right, and so the idea of security as immunity becomes a powerful metaphor in today's ages. And of course, as we'll discuss in a minute, there's a lot at stake in that idea. So